Welcome to Tales Told When the Windows Rattle. I'm Tim Prossel. Here's a story titled The Baron's Room, and it's by a writer named Ivy Hooper. I know nothing about Ivy Hooper, but I do know that this story was published in 1896 in a magazine called, believe it or not, Lucifer. Now, you might be saying to yourself, 1896, Victorian writer, her name is Ivy. How scary can this story be? Well, it's got some pretty grisly images, so little trigger warning there. Be warned, and please enjoy The Baron's Room. "It's very mean of you, Mr. Digby," said Miss Van Rensselaer of New York. "I want to learn all about your institutions, and you refuse me an introduction to your family ghost."
"Miss Van Rensselaer," replied her host, "ask me anything else and it's yours."
"You won't?"
"I'm sorry to use such a phrase to a lady. No, I won't."
It was Christmas Eve, and a small party of people were seated in the smoking room of Hensham House. Now, Hensham House was built in the 16th century, and like all properly constituted country houses, it owned a haunted room, in which Miss Van Rensselaer desired to spend the night. Her host being obdurate, she turned to her hostess. "Won't you persuade him, Mrs. Digby?"
"I'm afraid I must join forces with him, dear. Of course there's nothing in the story, but after Mrs. Leslie was found fainting in that room when her maid went to call her, we've never put anyone there."
Miss Van Rensselaer heaved a sigh. Then she brought her palms together with a joyful clap and spoke. "Here's Colonel Vansittart," she cried. "He's a British soldier and a V.C. You'll let him sleep in your haunted room, Mr. Digby, and tell us what he sees there?" Digby laughed. "Certainly," he said. "Vansittart shall sleep there if he wants to do so. I'm not afraid that he'll see the ghost." "There!" cried Miss Van Rensselaer. "You hear that, Colonel Vansittart? You'll sleep there tonight, won't you?" Colonel Vansittart knocked the ash from his cigar and made the following surprising answer. "I'm sorry to refuse you, Miss Van Rensselaer." "You won't sleep in that room? Well, you're not afraid of the ghost?" Colonel Vansittart glanced round the circle and answered deliberately, "I think I am, Miss Van Rensselaer." The listeners laughed. Then, as the speaker's face remained perfectly serious, they glanced at each other and were silent. Vansittart was a tough, bronzed soldier aged between 40 and 50, and had seen many phases of life in most of the countries of the globe. "You don't really believe there are such things as ghosts, Colonel Vansittart?" said Mrs. Digby. Colonel Vansittart smiled. He did not speak immediately, and she repeated her question. "I don't know," answered her guest slowly. "I don't say that I believe in ghosts. I say that I once spent the night in a haunted room, and no power on earth could make me sleep in another room with the same reputation." "Why not?" Vansittart paused. Then he said slowly and gravely, "Because though I've seen my share of horrors, I never saw anything that could compare with what I beheld there, and I don't want to see it again." "It's Christmas Eve," said Mrs. Digby. "A good hour for ghost stories. Tell us what you saw." Vansittart seemed a little averse to complying. A chorus of entreaty arose. He reflected for a few moments and finally began, speaking slowly and staring into the fire. "It was in the autumn of 18... I had been staying in Paris and was about to return to England when I met an acquaintance, Stanley by name. We were at Harrow together. I had not seen him since our school days, when he used to be a queer, silent fellow, rather impressionable and not over strong. He was rich and had never settled down to any occupation. He seemed to be inclined to moon about through life, just as he used to moon at school. We fraternized, as the stiffest Englishmen do when they meet abroad. He told me he was on his way to Touraine to see some property, vineyards and a wine manufactory, I believe, which he thought of buying from their owner, the widow of an Englishman. He suggested that I should accompany him, partly because Touraine is one of the most interesting districts in France from the antiquarian's point of view, Partly because I recently returned from California and knew something of vine growing. I consented, having nothing particular to do, and we started for Touraine together. The village whither we were bound was not far from Vouvray, and we arrived there on the morning of a November day. We put up at the inn, and Stanley went to call upon the would-be vendor of the vineyards. He was asked to dine with the family that night, and he accepted. Having done his business, he returned to me, and we went for a stroll. Outside the village, we came upon a quaint, picturesque old house, which was evidently uninhabited. We had entered the grounds and were engaged in exploring them, when a voice behind us inquired politely whether we had come with a view of taking the house, which was to let. We turned and saw an old man who was obviously a gardener or caretaker. We explained matters to him and inquired who was the owner of the house. Monsieur le Baron de... he said, but Monsieur le Baron did not live there. He had never occupied the house since he had succeeded to the property. Madame le Baron did not like the place. That is strange, I remarked, wishing to find something to say. The house is charmingly situated. The old man pursed up his lips and shook his head mysteriously. Perhaps, said he, it is not so strange as Monsieur thinks. A former Baron de... died there in that room. He pointed to a window on the first floor. He died by his own hand, monsieur, and though the good father has blessed the place, it is in vain. The room is frightful, monsieur. Oh, it is terrible. Haunted, cried Stanley. Isn't it incredible how these beliefs persist? A fine old house empty, and all because of a childish superstition. He had spoken in English, and then, addressing the man, he asked for the story. The old fellow was by no means sloth to talk. The house, he said, was very old, and as we could see, an exceedingly fine one. The old baron, who had been a notorious evil liver, had committed suicide by cutting his throat. This had occurred some 200 years ago, but since that time the house, or rather that particular room, had been uninhabitable. 4 persons in his memory had watched therein. One of these had died in raging delirium. One was found dead in the room from apoplexy. Another was now in a madhouse in Tours. The 4th had been found to have followed the evil example of the baron and taken his own life by cutting his throat with a knife from some Indian trophies on the wall. Connected with this last case, there had been one circumstance which was inexplicable. The knife with which the deed was done was found lying at a considerable distance from the corpse, which was stretched on a couch at one end of the room, the face slightly distorted, the limbs apparently composed with care. Despite the elaborate evidence with which our informant supported his tale, we were of course disposed to laugh at the whole affair. Stanley was especially amused, and it was he who proposed that we should spend the night in the haunted room. He had always, he told me, taken a great interest in these manifestations of human credulity. I was not particularly attracted in that direction, but still I was prepared to fall in with the project for the joke of the thing. The old man appeared to be genuinely terrified by our suggestion. At first he refused altogether to permit the experiment, but it was only when, after repeated solicitations, Stanley offered him a substantial bribe that he very reluctantly yielded, declaring even then that our blood was upon our own heads, and that he absolutely washed his hands of the consequences. We left him crossing himself and praying to the saints, and returned to the inn. Stanley went to dine with the widow and the son of the late proprietor of the vineyard and wine manufactory. Meanwhile, I dined alone at the inn, wrote a couple of letters, and then went out to call for Stanley, as we had arranged. The widow's house was on the way to the haunted chateau, and as I approached it, I saw Stanley waiting for me outside the gate. He was standing quite still, and as the moonlight shone on his face, it seemed to me that he was unusually pale, and that his eyes looked strange and glassy. "There you are," I said. "Are you ready to tackle Monsieur le Baron?" "Yes," he said after a slight pause. "I am ready." His voice also seemed strange, I thought. It sounded muffled and hollow. I glanced at him and could not help feeling slightly uncomfortable. Why had he grown so suddenly nervous, so much less confident than before? I whistled gently as we walked. He was silent, and his face seemed to grow more and more wild and startled. Sometimes he walked level with me, sometimes in advance, but he never lagged behind. Gradually, as we went on, I too became uncomfortably nervous. The sense of some horrible presence forced itself upon me. It was folly, and yet it was a feeling which it was impossible to shake off. I was conscious of an intense physical exhaustion, such as I had never before experienced. It felt as though some unseen power were making a frightful demand upon my vitality. At last we reached the chateau, and were there met by the old man, who began to entreat us even now at the 11th hour to abandon our enterprise. I should have wavered, but Stanley, throwing off his depression, insisted with a somewhat ghastly hilarity upon entering the house. Realizing presently that all his protests were useless, the old man at last relapsed into mournful silence, and reluctantly conducted us to the haunted room, which we found to be large, solidly furnished, and hung with tapestry which swayed and bulged out horribly with the draught, for it was a windy night, as though pressed by some hidden or spectral form. The room was fairly well lighted, but the corners were shadowy, and there were suits of armor in them, and again the gruesome idea thrust itself upon my imagination that the closed visors of the helmets might be hiding grinning skeleton heads or livid dead faces. There were chairs, a table, a couch, a cabinet of china, and the Indian knives and trophies of which we had heard were suspended on the wall. The wall at the end of the room was almost covered by a huge dusty mirror, and facing this mirror was the chair in which the Baron had died, in which it was said that he still appeared nightly to repeat his awful act. The old man left us. I locked the door, examined the room, and lit another candle. "Now then," I said with an assumption of cheerfulness, "we're ready for him, eh?" "Yes," said Stanley, but I noticed that he spoke in a strange, mumbling voice and began to pace to and fro. I really began to fear what might be the effect of fright upon the man's brain and nervous system. Although it was only a senseless terror, yet it might have disastrous results. "Look here, Stanley," said I don't relish this place much myself. If you don't like it either, let us go." He did not answer, but ceased his walk and stood staring into the mirror as though he were watching something. It was certainly becoming decidedly ghastly, and my nerves were getting so unstrung that when a mouse squeaked and rushed across the room, I fairly jumped with the fright. I again became conscious of the horror of some dreadful unseen presence, and of that strange and fearful drain upon my physical strength. Unmistakably, something in the room was trying to suck my life out of me. With all the strength remaining to me, I strove to set my will against that of this invisible yet palpable diabolical presence, and gradually I felt the drain lessen. The effort slackened, and I was able to breathe once more. I looked at Stanley and was overcome with horror at the pinched, drawn expression on his face. His voice was nothing but a low mutter when he spoke in answer to me. Suddenly he began to examine the trophies on the wall. He took down one of the knives with a strange convulsive clutch and looked earnestly at it. Then it slid from his hand and fell on the table, and again he began that restless, unnatural tramping to and fro, like a caged tiger ever rushing up and down its cage. "For mercy's sake, man," I cried impatiently, "sit down and talk like a rational being." He turned a pallid face and glittering eyes toward me, and continued his walk. 11:30 struck, and then the 11:45. "The Baron is nearly due," said I, trying to laugh. Stanley laughed too. If you can fancy the laugh of a dead man galvanized for a moment into a ghastly semblance of life by a devil, you may perhaps be able to form some idea of what his mirth was like. I shuddered in spite of myself, and with the irresistible dread that was beginning to steal over me, I felt the return of that tremendous drain upon my vitality which I had experienced twice previously. I never felt anything like it before or since, and the sense of overwhelming terror which it brought with it appeared to lessen my powers of resistance. The clock of the chateau began to toll midnight. Stanley made 3 long strides and sat down in the suicide's chair, close to the table where the knife had fallen. I felt a sickening thrill of horror. I sprang towards him, standing behind the chair, and caught him by the shoulders. "Great God, Stanley!" I cried. "Get up! That's the ghost's chair, and the time has come." His hand went out towards the table. A swirl of wind shrieking round the house blew out the tapestry near the mirror, and as I involuntarily looked up, here Vansittart's voice grew husky with horror. My eyes fell on the mirror in which I saw the whole room and its furniture reflected. I saw my own reflection, my hands clutching the figure in the chair. I saw what I clutched, and I swear to you that the thing I held was not Stanley. It was a man in the dress of the 17th century. It held in its hand the Indian knife which had lain on the table and was drawing that knife across its horrible severed throat. The face was one I had never seen before, discolored, ghastly, with fixed dead eyes and a horrible, grinning mouth that sneered at me with a travesty of mocking, malignant life. The thing sat stiffly in the chair, sawing at its throat, from which the blood was flowing. I had just time to realize the full horror of my position, that I was alone in the house with this monstrous companion, that the friend upon whom I had depended in undertaking this adventure had not only left me in the lurch, but had in some inexplicable manner himself changed into this frightful object. Before I fell to the ground in a faint. When I recovered consciousness, I found the old gardener and 2 younger men beside me. The sun was shining, and the broken door, which had been forced open, lay on the floor. I compelled myself to rise and cast a horror-stricken glance round. The knife lay on the floor with a red stain on the blade, but other stain there was none, and the horror of last night there was no longer. I began to question the men, who stated that they had found the door locked, and the windows being too narrow to permit their making entrance by them, they had forced the door and found me insensible. "Where was the other gentleman?" I inquired. "The other gentleman was not there," they replied. "The door was locked? Was the key inside?" "Yes, the key was inside, evidently just as I had left it last night." My hair literally rose on my head as I made for the inn. Stanley had not returned, but I found a letter from the son of the lady with whom he had dined. It stated that my friend had been seized with a sudden attack of giddiness and faintness, which had persisted so long that by the doctor's advice he had passed the night beneath their roof. I started at once to the widow's house and was met by her son, who appeared nervous and excited. He told me that Stanley had been assisted up the stairs with difficulty, and finally, as he seemed to be much better, was left for the night. He had been heard to lock his door, and his heavy breathing had been noticed at 10 o'clock when they had gone to rest. This morning they could not make him hear, and they were beginning to get very anxious about him, and indeed were just then considering whether it might not be advisable to break open the door. It had been just 10:30 when I met that appearance of Stanley outside the gate, and I already felt intuitively a horrible certainty as to what I should see as I accompanied the young man to the door of the room. It was locked, as he had said, and no reply came to our knocking, so we forced it open. Stanley lay on the bed. He was perfectly still. The bedclothes were not in any way disarranged. His face, the eyes slightly open, was like a mask of yellow wax. All the color had flowed away from it with that which stained the whiteness of the sheet and curdled on the parquet floor. Across the throat was a terrible wound. The young fellow who had accompanied me gave a cry of horror and dismay. Presently he began a fruitless search for the weapon that had inflicted the dreadful injury, but I did not join him, for I knew that he would not find it. I knew that it was hung with the Indian curiosities on the wall of the Baron's room.
You know, I really wish this story went on for one more paragraph, because I would love it if we went back to Hemsham House and that little Christmas party with Miss Van Rensselaer and the Digbys, and to see the look on their faces when the Colonel finished his story. Are they just horrified, or are they a little bit confused? Because now that I've read this story a few times, I'm confused, and I like that. I like that about the story, the unsolved mystery. Was the appearance of Stanley that met the Colonel before they went on their ghost hunt, was that Stanley's ghost? A ghost hunt with a ghost? Was that Stanley's astral projection, and they went on the ghost hunt and the Baron somehow killed the physical body of Stanley? Or was that the Baron? And he's just good at disguise, and he's good at getting out of that room. We'll never know. Now, this story could fit into several different anthologies. For instance, there's a strong hint of a psychic vampire, so maybe it could go into an anthology of vampire stories. There's the haunted room tradition, which is very strong and reaches far back. But I put it into an anthology of stories in which the writer attempts to capture something of oral tradition on the page. It's called Echoing Ghost Stories, Literary Reflections of Oral Tradition. Some of the authors who have worked in this tradition are Harriet Beecher Stowe. She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Have you ever heard of Andrew Lang? He collected fairy tales and ghost stories. He wrote one of the stories here. Ivy Hooper is there, whoever that is. Mary E. Wilkins Freeman you might have heard of. I bet you've heard of Ambrose Bierce, Edith Wharton, and especially M.R. James. You can find out more about this at brownbonesbooks.com. Brown Bones Books, no spaces between those words. And the title again is Echoing Ghost Stories, Literary Reflections of Oral Tradition. Look for that page and you'll find out more information. You'll also find links to online bookstores if you're interested. I'm Tim Prossel, and thank you very much for listening.